Uber, Netflix, Amazon. These companies completely blew up the taxi, television, and shopping industries. Why? Because disruptive companies and ideas upend markets by doing something truly different, right? They see a need, a void, and they dare to create something that completely evolves the market. So the big question is, how do we take the frameworks of disruptive innovation and apply them to ourselves, right? If we want to be successful in unexpected ways, we have to follow our own disruptive path, right? Dare to innovate, do something astonishing, dream big, right? And with a pandemic that is completely disrupting our way of life, how do we make it a priority to grow in times of uncertainty? To answer this very question, we have our wonderful guest, Whitney Johnson. She's the CEO of WLJ Advisors and the best-selling author of Disrupt Yourself. Going to be a fantastic episode. My name is Eric Pill, the host of the Benefits Buzz podcast. Ready, set, let's get buzzed. Hey everyone, welcome to another fun episode of Benefits Buzz. I'm feeling a bit lonely. My wonderful co-host Kelsey isn't feeling well, so I am riding solo on this podcast. I'm going to miss our friendly banter, but I've got someone else to have a lot of fun banter with. I've got the one and only Whitney Johnson on our podcast today. I'm going to take a deep breath because she has a lot of accolades. She's the CEO of WLJ Advisors, one of the 50 leading business thinkers, according to Thinkers 50, a best-selling author of Disrupt Yourself, and the host of the weekly podcast, Disrupt Yourself. Woohoo! Whitney, I love that dossier. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Eric. It's a delight to be here.
Well, I am delighted to have you on the show. This is a really treat for us, and what a powerful topic we're going to talk about today: growing in times of uncertainty. It's one of the things we kind of forget about, right? We kind of get in survival mode, I think, for a while, we're like, what do we do? Where's my family? Is everything okay? How's my job? Where are we at? Right. And I think some of that has simmered down a little bit, right, as we sort of try to navigate this sort of new normal. I hate to use air quotes here, but I'm using them if you could see me. And I think now we're at, okay, this is sort of how we need to kind of work in the world now. And we need to start really focusing on how do we continue to innovate ourselves? How do we innovate our organizations? Because we can't be laggards in this, right? This is the time for us to really dive in and figure out how we continue to evolve. And so what a fantastic time to have you on the show and to really dive into this. So thank you again. I think to start, let's just focus on you. I think with this experience, I love to hear about kind of your career, and specifically, what kind of was that aha moment that led you to write Disrupt Yourself?
Yeah, such a great question. And I think it starts with the aha moment came when I was working on Wall Street, and I read a book by Clayton Christensen called The Innovator's Dilemma. Some of your listeners are going to be familiar with that. He was a professor at the Harvard Business School. And I had this big aha that disruption isn't just about products and services and companies and countries. It's also about people. And the reason I had that aha is because I had, throughout my career, disrupted myself. I had grown up in California, very solidly middle-class background. I studied music in college. But then when I graduated from college, my husband and I, we moved to New York. I was terrified to go to New York. I would never have gone there by myself. But my husband's in school, so we go to New York. For the first week, I won't, leave my apartment, but we need to eat. So I finally leave our 19th floor apartment and go out and get a job. Now, because I had studied music in college, I played piano, because I had zero connections in New York, because I clearly had very little confidence. And at the risk of stating what may be obvious to all of your listeners, I'm a female. My first job was as a secretary to a stockbroker, 1345 Avenue of the Americas, because you always remember the address of your very first place of employment. But what happened for me is I would go to work every day, and there's this bullpen of young stockbrokers, aspiring masters of the universe. Pressure to open accounts is intense. So they say things like, throw down your pom-poms and get in the game. And at first, I'm a little offended because I was a cheerleader in high school. But after I'm listening to this over and over again, I realized it was time to throw down my pom-poms. And I would not have known to call it this then, but that was really the beginning of me disrupting myself, disrupting who I was, disrupting who I thought I could be. And so then my career started to take off. I started to take business courses at night and moved into investment banking and did equity research. And it was at that point I came across The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen and started to put these pieces together of this isn't just about products and services. This is about us. This idea of personal disruption. And so that was really the genesis of this idea. I didn't end up writing the book for another 10 years, but it started to form in my mind and eventually came out in the book, the first edition of which was published in 2015.
I love that. What an inspiring story. And I love that you actually have an aha moment. Sometimes when you ask that question, it's so like, well, it's just a series of things, but I love that you can go back to that aha moment and share that with us. I think sometimes when you read books and you kind of have those epiphanies, they really can change sort of the dynamic of your career. And I think obviously that was kind of maybe your hope with Disrupt Yourself, right? Is to take what you learned and the things that impacted you and package that up, right? And share that with organizations and individuals. And I have to know, do you still play piano?
Well, that is a very long answer to a very short question. So when I graduated from college, I was sort of done. I'm sort of fraught emotional issues around music, which sometimes we do with childhood passions. But the short answer to the question is I've started to play again and not playing classical piano. So I'm disrupting how I'm approaching it and really doing things like playing by ear and listening to YouTube videos and figuring out chord progressions and playing them in all 12 keys. And it's been a lot of fun to approach music as an expert, but also as a beginner.
I like that. I had to ask. I played piano until about sophomore year of high school. I got as far as the entertainer, and then I quit. But I'm definitely a lover of piano and music. So I hope you don't mind me digressing from our conversation. But I think that's really fascinating that you still do that. Well, I want to talk about Disrupt Yourself, and I want to understand sort of using that as sort of kind of a philosophy. Maybe if you could tell us what is some of the advice that you provide organizations and their employees, and maybe just kind of give a quick synopsis of what the Disrupt Yourself is hoping to share with organizations.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so let's start basic definition, disruptive innovation. So that's the term coined by Clayton, and it's at its simplest a silly little thing that takes over the world, like the telephone did to the telegraph, like the automobile did to the horse and buggy. More recently, we've seen Netflix disrupt Blockbuster, and now cable TV and Uber is disrupting cabs. And so it's that silly little thing that takes over the world. And so the aha for me was, okay, I think there's also this thing called personal disruption. And this is how you take all of those ideas and apply them to you, where you start at the bottom of a ladder, you climb to the top, and then you jump to the bottom of a new ladder. But the big difference with personal disruption is you are, in this instance, you're both Netflix and Blockbuster, you're Uber and Cab, you're this silly little thing, and you take over the world, because with personal disruption, you are disrupting you.
That's such a cool concept. I think we've all noticed the disruptions that have been happening right in these big industries and, and in those companies that you talked about. And now it's like, how do you apply those disruptions to yourself? That's super fascinating, because I think it's easy for us, just like maybe it was easy for some of those companies to kind of just do what we've always done. And that's not where the learning is. That's not where the growth is. And so how do we be proactive about, disrupting ourselves? So given that, I know this book, Disrupt Yourself, is a couple of years old, but like it could not be any more timely, with COVID-19 and everything that's happened. They talk about disruption,
Yeah.
We're so almost forced to either say, how do we keep going as we were, or how does this exterior kind of force disrupt our everyday? So what are some of the concerns, challenges that you're hearing about the most right now when you work with individuals and companies?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So I think one of the things, and you're not going to be surprised at all, in fact, everybody who's listening is not going to be surprised, is things like I'm overwhelmed and I'm scared. The Boston Globe did a survey not too long ago and asked people, how are you feeling? How are you doing? And 25% of the people said they've never been more scared in their life. And there was an article in USA Today survey just this past week where it says 40% of Americans struggled with mental health and substance abuse in June. And so one of the things that we see is my operating premise is that the fundamental unit of growth in any organization is the individual, but it's also therefore the fundamental deterrent. That people are the fundamental deterrent, and so it always comes back to this notion of, okay, we've got disruption, and it is happening all around us. The only way for us to manage through, to thrive in disruption, is to figure out ways to disrupt ourselves in both small and large ways.
Yeah, that I can definitely, if I look at myself in the mirror, right, I can definitely see, sort of that ebb and flow when the pandemic hit and you're kind of every day, now you're at home, and I was trying to figure out how to work with kids in the house and teach, right? Like disruption everywhere. And I you kind of either get in this funk, and I kind of had this one morning I woke up and said, I can't operate like this. This isn't going away. So how do I change and disrupt my everyday routine so that I can come to my office, which is my kids' playroom, by the way? How can I come, right? Yeah, motivated and energetic. And I had to change the fundamentals and how I, went about my day and the things I focused on. And that's really interesting. So I love that. So I have to understand there has to be huge opportunities for growth that you're seeing as a result of the way businesses have changed through the pandemic. So can you talk about what you're seeing?
So before we go there, just a quick comment, because I think you used the word routine, which I think is really important, is that we think, okay, disruption. And yes, there's a lot of disruption happening around us. And yes, we need to disrupt ourselves, but we need to anchor that disruption in routine. And so I think that that's a really important thing for us to consider, is that, every day, no matter what, there need to be some things that we do. Maybe we get up at the same time every day. Maybe you take a walk with your children at the same time every day. Maybe you eat at the same time every day, because the more you can chunk some of the behaviors that you have control over, then the more safe you're going to feel. And then that's going to free up that cognitive and emotional capacity that you're going to need, the wherewithal you need to deal with and disrupt yourselves in ways that you need to in order to manage through the disruption. So I just wanted to give a shout out for routine, because I think it's really important. And as people are going back to school, it's easy to let that slip, and we need to double down on routine.
Awesome. Thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, like calculated ways to have disruption in certain areas, but really have routines be sort of a good foundation. So thank you for providing that clarity. So going back to that, then, what are the opportunities for growth that you see? There's got to be tons, right? Like, how has the pandemic shifted that?
Yeah, don't you like how I just disrupted your flow, your thought, where we were going? Thanks. Now you have permission to disrupt me at some point. Okay.
Well, I did ask you about your piano, so maybe we're even now.
There we are. Yeah, we're even. Okay. So I think there's I have a few thoughts on that. So first of all, most obvious is when and how we work. So Callie Yost, you may be familiar with her work. She's an expert on work-life fit. She's been pressing for several decades for us to rethink how we're working. And yet the way we were working was like that incumbent, right? And this disruption that has happened, those legacy systems that were in place, they have just been disassembled. They have been dismantled. We were compartmentalizing our lives. Some ways were good, many ways were not. And so, in the words of Ronald Reagan, tear down those walls. We have torn down those walls. And I think that is a great opportunity for growth as individuals, fusing our professional and our personal lives. I think a corollary to that is Zoom calls. I think there's been amazing democratization that has taken place, where you've got some people are more extroverted and some people are taller and some people are shorter and some people take up more space and less space. You've got the chat box, and there's this thing that's happened as a consequence of everybody being on Zoom, this equalization that has taken place that I think is really positive. And then the third is that people are getting things done a lot faster. And I have a story that I want to share with you quickly that I think illustrates all three of these. We recently had Michelle McKenna, who's the Chief Information Officer at the NFL, on our podcast, episode 172. And I was fascinated because what I found out is number one, they had to work remotely, not surprising, but they put together that virtual draft in less than 2 months, right? A year ago, it might have taken them a year to put together that draft. So number one, much faster. Number two, the idea for this virtual draft was initially seeded by someone who was very junior, started putting something in the chat box. It starts to float up. Would that idea have ever been seen by really senior people a year ago? And then the third thing that I thought was so interesting is that in the draft, you saw, children of managers and coaches and owners sort of wandering in the background. And that was so delightful. And you had these managers saying that was one of their favorite parts because their children got to see them at work. And so that to me is this, fusion of our work and life, people, democratization of ideas. We're doing things a lot faster. And that story of the NFL draft, I think, illustrates all of those opportunities for growth that are taking place, not only for the NFL, but in every single one of our workplaces.
It's great to look at what's happened in that light sometimes. And I love to hear those examples, right? Because they're tangible for us, because sometimes it's so easy to go to, well, now we're all remote and I miss talking to there's a lot of things that you can look at the negative side, but I would agree there are some awesome opportunities for where we've seen the disruption, where we found better ways to work together, and where ideas can percolate a lot, quicker up the chain maybe than they have in the past. And so that's really cool perspectives. Thanks for sharing. I want to dive a little bit. The book is truly fascinating. Disrupt Yourself. Pick up a copy if you haven't, those who are listening. You talk about an S curve in your book. And this is sort of the one time in the podcast I want to dive into some of the nitty gritty in your book, but it's kind of that psychology of disrupting ourselves, right? Mm-hmm. And we kind of, sometimes when we want to disrupt ourselves, we kind of have ebbs and flows. And I love for you to talk through, like, how do we, if we want to be better at mastering ourselves and disrupting ourselves and growth, do you have suggestions on how we start? Or how do we begin that journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've now argued for this idea of personal disruption. You start at the bottom, you climb to the top of the ladder, and then you jump. Now, the way that you can think about what this looks like is create this mental picture of an S. And I want you to all draw an S in your mind right now. And every time we start something new, we are at the bottom of this S. And this is based on the work of E.M. Rogers, and it looks at how quickly an innovation will be adopted. But we're looking at this S as a model, a mental model for how we grow. So you started a new role, you've started a new job, you started a new project. You are at the base of that S. And what we know at the base of that S is that growth is going to feel like it is very slow. It's not that it's not happening, but it feels slow. It feels like a slog. And so that helps you once you know that is, I'm starting this new project. It feels like a slog. I'm feeling a little bit discouraged. That's how I'm supposed to feel. But then you put in the work and you put in the effort. And with time, you start to accelerate into competence. And with this comes confidence. And now you're not at the base of that S anymore. So you're continuing to draw that S. You're moving into the steep, sleek back of that S. And so whereas at the bottom, it felt like it took a lot of time for something to happen. Now in a little time, a lot happens. This is the sweet spot where it's exhilarating and all your neurons are firing. So this is the engagement. This is that place where you ideally want to spend as much of your time as possible. Then, after a while, you've put in this time and it's been really exciting. But as you get to the top of that S, the growth starts to slow. And this time it actually is slowing. And whereas you were learning at a very rapid pace, now you're not learning as fast. You're not enjoying the feel-good effects of learning. You're not getting that dopamine. You're now at the top of your S curve of learning. And so you've learned. Now it's time for you to leap and repeat. Now it's time for you to disrupt yourself. And so if you want to figure out, okay, so in my current role, where am I on the S curve? You can go to our website, scurvelocator.com, and take this test and identify where you are. But it will help you think through, where am I, and what do I need to do to build momentum depending on where I am. So that's a starting point. See what other questions you have as we dive into this.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I have to imagine, do you recommend, obviously maybe as I think about my own stuff again, as I try to, process this concept, sometimes you can kind of find yourself maybe on one part of the S curve with one thing you're trying to evolve in yourself. And, can you be on multiple parts of a curve with multiple disruptions, or do you recommend taking on one S curve at a time? You know what I mean? What's your suggestion there?
Oh, that's a great question, Eric. Well, so one observation, I think, kind of high level observation is right now, all of us are at the bottom of an S curve in some respects or another. And that's part of the reason why the world is difficult right now, is because usually you've got some people in the sweet spot and some people at the high end, but we have all been disrupted. We're all at the bottom of that S as a society. And so that's part of why we're so challenged. To answer your specific question, yes, absolutely. So in your family life, you can be in one place on the S. In your career or as a domain expert, you might potentially be at the top of the S. In your current role, you've just taken on a brand new role. You've got new people reporting to you. You've started a new business. You could be at the base of that S. And so what you're trying to do is optimize so that you might know exactly what you're doing from a domain perspective, but have enough challenge that you're able to be in the sweet spot, because that's where you're going to be at your best in terms of being engaged and excited about the work that you're doing.
That's awesome. That makes a lot of sense. And I know in your book you talk about sort of those 7 different steps, right, to achieve that. And so again, I wish we had more time to dive into all that, but listeners, definitely check out the book. It's a fantastic guide to work you through that S curve and to reach that mastery. So I want to know, you are in a great position because I know you work with a lot of different types of businesses. You work with a variety of employees, probably a lot of executives. On your podcast, you talk to very important, smart individuals. And so I want to take all that knowledge and help our listeners learn. What are some trends that you're seeing? Are there certain employees or businesses or individuals that you think are navigating sort of these, I don't know, choppy pandemic waters better than others? And if so, why? What are, if someone's struggling right now, are there any suggestions on or things that we can learn from those individuals to make us get through this a little bit easier? Right?
I love that, choppy pandemic waters. It's such a great visual image, especially because we were just talking about the S curve and the S curve wave. So in our framework, so we've talked about the S curve of learning framework, and then we also have the personal disruption framework, which has 7 points of how you can move up that S curve quickly. And one of those points is to be driven by discovery. So it's that ability to take a step forward into ambiguity, into uncertainty, to gather feedback and adapt, to basically respond without being reactive. And a great example of that, I've really enjoyed watching and observing him. His name is Davis Smith, and he's the CEO and founder of a company called Cotopaxi. They make outdoor gear. They've got a very strong social good mission. And one thing that I loved, first of all, that he did is that they've got retail stores. So when COVID happened, he had to furlough people, and he was willing to talk out loud about, this is hard. We are sad about this, and really acknowledge the loss that they were experiencing. And so that gave everybody else permission to grieve. But then he's also been very willing to say, okay, now what do we need to do? So he helped raise $100,000 to donate for relief funds, And then he converted their factories that they were using for outdoor gear to make, to create face masks. And so he's really been willing to say, I'm going to take a step forward. I'm going to get all the feedback around me, and then I'm going to adapt. And the other thing that he's done, and this goes to another point of personal disruption, is he's not saying, why me? That is such a victim mentality, and it doesn't serve us. Instead, he's like, what am I going to do? He's acting and not being acted upon. And so I would say people that are managing this well are acting, they're not being acted upon, they're responsive, they're not reactive, and they're willing to walk into the unknown. Korn Ferry did a study that said that the leading predictors of success for C-suite executives, but I think it's true for everybody, technical skills, they were important, but it was the ability to walk into the unknown, to deal with that ambiguity, to, like I said, take a step forward, to gather feedback and adapt.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, I think the listeners hit the jackpot there. Some really good advice that you were able to share there, because I know, there are individuals that are probably handling this adversity differently, right? And organizations who are handling the adversity that's in front of us now differently. And those are fantastic tips. I wish we could talk about, I really do. I wish we could talk about this forever. This is so fascinating. It really is. And I can't thank you enough for your time. Maybe to wrap things up here, how can, I feel like we just, to use the cliche, the tip of the iceberg here, I'm talking about choppy waters and icebergs. I'm all over the place with my analogies today. But how can we really have, I know organizations and individuals are hungry for more information here from you on this. Where can they go, or how can they learn more about, disrupt yourself, or really just kind of managing these times? Is there a site you might recommend them go to, or a resource?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing is to go take the S-Curve Locator. You can download it, scurvelocator.com. You're going to get signed up for our newsletter, but you can always unsubscribe if you don't want it afterwards. If you want to listen to Michelle McKenna, who talked about the NFL draft, you can go to episode 172 of our podcast. And then you can also listen to episode 80 of our podcast called Disrupt Yourself. That'll go a little bit deeper into these ideas. Or another podcast, which we didn't talk about, is this idea of playing to your strengths, episode 140. Because I do think right now there's a huge opportunity. Your strengths are going to come out to play in ways that are unexpected. And so I would encourage you to listen to that because when things are difficult, your strengths show up. I want you to think about how you can use them very, very deliberately.
That's awesome. Great resources there. And I thought of one more question. I don't care if we're going a little long on time. You're too great of a guest to cut off short. So I'm putting myself in the shoes of HR professionals. They're concerned about themselves, their own disruption and growth, but they're also, it's their job to be concerned about their employees and their well-being. Any other tips to help HR professionals specifically kind of get through this time, or even promote this type of disrupt yourself learning and philosophy within their organization?
Yeah. So again, this idea of playing to your strengths, I would give two other suggestions. One is that we're all at the launch point. We're all in that inexperienced part of the curve. And so how you deal with disruption defines you. And part of that means is that when you are at the launch point, there's this tendency, your ego is screaming, your identity is like, I don't know who I am. Make sure that you use this time to learn. And one of the best ways to do that is just to reflect, even for 1 or 2 minutes a day, what worked today, what didn't, so that you allow yourself to not shelter in place at the top of the old curve, but to be in this place at the bottom of this new S curve. And then the last suggestion I would make, and this goes to another one of our 7 points, is step back to grow. And what do I mean when I say that? Take a break and rest. That is what people need to do. And there's this wonderful quote by Tiffany Shlain. She wrote a book called 24/6, and she says, what if we thought of rest as technology? The promise of technology is that it makes things efficient, it saves time, it allows us to get things done. And then she's advocating for something called a tech Shabbat. But basically, when we rest, taking time to rest becomes the ultimate technology. And so that would be what I would encourage every single person who's listening, including HR leaders, is to take that break, whatever that looks like for you. Unplug in some form or fashion, because we are in this disruption. We may be here for the long haul. And in order for us to have that emotional and physical and intellectual capacity, we have to refuel. And the best way to do that is to take a break.
Oh, I love that suggestion. It's going to be the top on my list as school gets started here. Kids going back to school, remotely, virtually. I think a break is definitely in order, and finding the right ways to squeeze it in is important to recharge. So I love those last minute tips. Whitney, thank you so much. This has just been a wonderful dialogue. Such wonderful nuggets I know that our listeners can take and apply, and you've provided awesome resources for them to go and continue this kind of, journey in terms of learning really how to disrupt yourself and continue to grow. So thank you so much, for one podcast host to another, for coming on the show today.
Eric, thanks for having me.
WEX is in the business of simplifying benefits for everyone. Now, although we certainly hope our podcast sparks some aha moments, like that was pretty cool, but of course we cannot provide legal, investment, or financial advice. And, therefore, nothing shared in this podcast should be interpreted as such. We encourage you to seek out appropriate professional advice regarding your plans. Hey, congratulations! You made it through our disclaimer. Thanks for listening.